I'm Tracy Nicholas, and my co-host, Tanya Carwyn, and I are passionate folklore practitioners. To us, folkloring is more than a podcast. It's our commitment to help you connect with your roots and awaken the wisdom within you.
Hi, and welcome to this episode of the Folklore Podcast. This week, we're diving into a topic that, for me, is very much at the heart of my love for folklore, and that is the concept that folklore can be, and very often is, an active resistance to the many isms in our world: colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, white supremacy, patriarchy, classism, and we could go on. But before we dive into that meaty subject, Tracy, what have you been folkloring lately?
Actually, I have kind of a fun one this time. So I don't know if you've heard of this or not, but there has been in the news lately something called the Chicago rat hole. So it's basically an impression in the sidewalk that's in Chicago, and it's in a residential neighborhood. It's been there for many, many years. And a couple of weeks back, there was an influencer that had a fairly large following, and he posted a picture of it. And subsequently, what happened was people, mostly tourists, but people started going and taking pictures of it. And then it snowballed from there, and people built a shrine to the rat and they named the rat.
It's like an impression in concrete or something.
Exactly. And they were leaving offerings for the rat, and they named the rat. And so, honestly, the best theory that I've heard is that it was not really a rat at all. It was a squirrel that had fallen out of a tree, because rats are nocturnal, but squirrels are diurnal. And it's very unlikely that there would have been wet cement in the middle of the night. So they think that it was actually a squirrel. But anyway, so this whole big thing built up around it. So I did drive into the city to go take a picture of the rat hole. And it was for journalistic purposes only. It's for a different podcast. But it was kind of weird and fun. There were a couple other people there doing the same thing, and I got to talking with them about the whole experience. So it was very interesting.
Yeah, so such nice urban folklore too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what about you? How have you been folkloring?
Yeah, mine is not nearly as fun and unusual as that one, but we just had in bulk here, and I did manage to make a whole ton of beeswax candles on Candlemas, the 2nd of February. Did not take them to a Catholic church to get blessed, although I was thinking about it for a minute. But yeah, I just now have a stack of beeswax candles ready for the year.
That's nice. They smell so good.
Oh, it's amazing. And it's, with all the issues with other waxes burning in the house, and like smells and things like that. Beeswax is still, like, as far as I can tell, the only one that actually purifies the air and, smells good for you.
Yep. Okay. Should we dive into all of the isms and resistance?
Ooh, let's do it. And before we start, I think it's important to also address the origins of the science or study that is named folklore, which in and of itself has some problematic origin stories. And I think it's important to call that before we start in with how folklore can maybe be a factor in resistance to all the other isms. The roots of folklore studies, so not folklore itself, right? Folklore itself is just the knowledge of a folk. And, that goes back to probably Paleolithic times.
Right.
But when people started studying folklore, the roots of that can be traced back to the 19th century, specifically in Northern Europe, and then even more specifically in Britain. And there was sort of a romanticization of simple and authentic aspects, and simple and authentic is meant to be read or listened to in quotes. The simple and authentic aspects of culture in response to industrialization and modernization of society. So a lot of people were now not living on the land anymore, but were in towns, often overcrowded, and working in factories. And so kind of a harkening back to the idyllic times before industrialization. That's kind of where the study of folklore finds its rise. And the people who were studying folklore were not the people living in those working in those factories and living in crowded conditions in town, but it was white upper class Europeans who were driven by a sense of nostalgia, and a desire to preserve what they perceived as vanishing traditions. And so they started turning their attention to the lives of peasants. And there was a tendency to idealize rural life and viewing it as a repository of all the things that were pure and good and authentic and untainted cultural heritage. And so, out of this movement, we find scholars like the Brothers Grimm in Germany, folklorists in other European countries. They played a significant role in collecting and preserving folktales, myths, and traditions. But of course, the perspective of these scholars was shaped by their own cultural biases and social positions. And so we can be grateful to the likes of the Brothers Grimm for collecting folktales, but we should not forget that they were who they were. And so one of the issues with the study of folklore was that it was fueled by and maybe used to promote nationalism. And of course, we all know that that didn't have very great results in Europe in the beginning of the 20th century. And so while I always struggle with nationalism, I think there's something beautiful and good about being proud of your heritage and your nationality and your culture. Of course, when that becomes something like, yeah, but my culture is better than your culture, and we start talking about things like uber race theories, we have a huge problem.
Right.
And so, yeah, one of the big problems was that the people who were really studying folklore were people who were already by class or by influence and power kind of removed from the people that they were studying. So, yeah, that is something to always keep in mind. I think that we're looking at a culture from our own culture's lens.
Right. And I think even in America, I think it was even worse because if you're talking about studying like indigenous folklore, you don't have the understanding of the society as a whole when you're trying to capture and study that kind of thing. So it's even more of a divide in that case.
Yeah, and then you see things like the noble savage arising, right? Those
Right.
sorts of, like, yeah, in America you had it with kind of romanticizing Native Americans. And we see similar issues in folklore studies that we see in anthropology as well. And I studied anthropology, and so I'm pretty aware of that. So, as we already mentioned, we have cultural bias and ethnocentrism when we're talking of looking at the folklore of colonized people. And like we can pull that far back, right? We can say that the tribes of Europe were also colonized by the Romans. And so there's a colonial legacy that we need to be aware of, as well as power dynamics and representation. We must guard against the objectification of cultures. And in that case, specifically, the lack of indigenous voices. In anthropology, it's not considered science if you got too close to the culture that you're studying. And it's similarly considered that people from a culture talking about their own culture, it's hard to be viewed in like people in from a scientific perspective tend to not feel like it's good science. So yeah, lack of indigenous voices we see in anthropology and in folklore as well. The impact of the research in and of itself on the communities we view, and of course, like so we're looking at gender and intersectionality within communities from a different lens. Yeah, traditional gender roles are often misinterpreted, and that continues to happen right now. We still, as a Western people, we think we're so much more evolved now. And so we go to traditional cultures and we look at specific gender roles, and we slap our own interpretation onto that. And there's like some great examples that maybe we'll get into later. And then we have classicism and ableism comes in as well.
I think a couple of things came up for me when you were talking about the impact of research on communities. I immediately
Mhm.
thought of the Prime Directive from Star Trek, where they're
Yeah.
not supposed to change anything.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that we see things like classism and ableism in folklore as well as anthropology. When you're
Hmm.
talking about, stories that were about changelings or demon babies, and that would be, totally ableist because it was a very thinly veiled look at people who were differently abled. If they had Down syndrome, people were looking for explanations of that. And that's kind of what those stories turned into. So I do see the similarities there.
Yeah, absolutely. And we could go on about this for a while, but this particular episode is more about how folklore often is and can be used as resistance. So I think we're going to dive into that section. So I think the first thing that we need to look at is folklore gives a culture a resilience against erasure, and why erasure occurs, and then into how it occurs. And then we'll look deeper into how folklore plays a role in resisting that erasure. So, why erasure occurs, dominant groups tend to suppress the narratives of the marginalized communities to maintain control over the prevailing narrative, their narrative, and as a mechanism to reinforce existing structures of authority. I also believe that this also happens because I don't believe most people are evil. And even if you're part of a dominant group, you don't see yourself as evil. And so that story needs to be reinforced, right? Like if you don't know what you don't know, you can't be faulted for doing what you're doing.
Right. You can only believe in what you know. And they always say the winner is the one who writes history, right? The one who comes out
Exactly.
in the power position. And they are writing
Yep.
it from their perspective. Nobody thinks they're the villain.
Exactly. Suppressing narratives of marginalized communities within your own community serves in a big way to make you not feel bad about yourself. So, marginalized communities having a voice is a threat to the dominant narrative, right? So, if you
Right.
challenge dominant narratives, history, like you said, culture or identity, that's a threat to the dominant narratives. And so, a tool to silence alternative perspectives that undermine established power structures is important because you don't want your power structures undermined. Another reason is cultural homogenization. Often we see efforts to assimilate diverse communities into one singular cultural identity. And we still often see that as a way of like integration and giving everybody the same opportunities. And if we are all just more or less the same, supposedly we're all supposed to get along better. I clearly don't believe that that's true. And I think diverse communities can just get along without
Right.
homogenization.
But I think that that's part of the guilt of being sort of in that dominant position. And if you have to look too closely at other cultures, other diversity, I think that that brings up in people, I don't want to think about whether or not I'm wrong in this dominant culture. They want to feel more comfortable.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a huge one. Discomfort in the dominant population, right? Like those people are too loud, or those people are too crazy, or their food smells weird, or
Right.
this makes me feel uncomfortable. And instead of, wondering why or getting curious, it's easier to say, well, if we all just ate hamburgers, life would be better. So there's ways in which erasure manifests that are pretty well documented, and you can actually see pretty clearly if you look around with curious eyes. So one of the many ways that it manifests erasure is exclusion from written records. And as you said
Hmm.
earlier, history is written by the winner. The
Right.
documenting happens by upper classes.
Yeah, and I think that it's interesting when you start to look at those that are in power. I think that it's key to note that there is a difference between propaganda and folklore,
Yeah.
right? The propaganda are stories that are being pumped out to maintain whatever narrative it is. And even if you are resisting and using propaganda, you're getting a specific narrative out there. You're not just going back and using folklore to maintain the culture. You're pushing an agenda with propaganda.
I think one of the differences, at least in my mind, is that propaganda is a conscious choice, right? You're making
Right,
a conscious decision to say something to manipulate a
right,
populace or whatever, where folklore is not. It arises from a folk soul and tradition and long lineage, usually. So, exclusion from written records, censorship, and suppression. We tend to ban specific stories or songs or cultural practices that are threatening to the status quo. The suppression, the aim of it is to prevent transmission of these elements across generation.
right. And I mean, you saw this in, the early slave trade in America.
Mm-hmm.
The people who were the owners wanted to keep the slaves illiterate,
Mm-hmm.
and it was specifically forbidden that they practice anything related to their roots and their African cultures. And they wanted to drive that out of them and say, no, you're going to be Christians now.
Yep.
And so people who were brought together from many different parts of Africa were told, no, you can't share your heritage and your stories and your culture. And they would be severely punished if they were caught doing so.
Yeah, and not just with enslaved people, you see it in general with colonized people, right? With Christianity coming in, it's not appropriate anymore to practice your own spirituality. And you see it all over the world you see the Native American schools. The same thing happened to the Sami in Scandinavia, where children were taken from the home and so that you couldn't transmit cultural practices and language and things like that. Of course, another way and a kind of a big word and something that we're becoming more aware of in the West, which is a good thing, of course, is cultural appropriation. Erasure can also occur through cultural appropriation where elements of a culture are borrowed or co-opted without proper acknowledgement or often even proper understanding. This process dilutes the original meaning and the context of an art form or a spiritual practice or things like that. And it erases the cultural nuances tied to those elements. And you're starting to see that more and more with like ayahuasca ceremonies where I live. It's kind of a hip thing for a bunch of white women to get together and do cacao ceremonies. And obviously, we have the whole smudging, burning white sage, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, when you take it out of the cultural context of those practices, it's really just performative, right? You think that it looks good. You think that it's like, oh, this is a cool thing to do. And it loses the story really behind it.
Mhm.
And then it's just a show.
I do think that there is a big thing that underlies it is a deep yearning within people that are divorced from their own spiritual inheritance, which is often people in diaspora. And what we see a lot is like the white upper classes, right? We don't really have a lineage going back to pre-Christian times. So if you're not a member of a big world religion, if you're not a Christian or a Jew or a Buddhist or a Muslim, you don't really have a connection to any spiritual lineage. And so you start searching. I believe a lot of it comes from that. And like I do believe that a lot of ceremonies like you might partake in and you actually feel something that you've never felt before and now you just want more of it without taking into consideration all the things we've talked about, right?
Right. I don't think the instinct itself is bad to want to explore some of these different practices.
Mhm.
I guess the point is learn about what is underlying and why things are the way they are. And, find someone who does understand that
Right.
culture
Right.
and learn about it before you just say, well, this is a cool thing to do.
Right.
And I do appreciate that people want to seek out a deeper spirituality.
Mhm.
And so I absolutely understand why people want to do it.
Yep.
It's just a matter of, are you really getting into what is underlying for some of these practices?
Absolutely. And I do also believe that there are people who are just in it to make a quick buck, right?
Sure, of course.
Yep. Another issue that we can look at is displacement and dispossession. Communities facing displacement or dispossession may experience erasure as their histories are tied to specific lands. And we see that, for example, in the colonial history of Ireland, right? People
Right.
were dispossessed of their lands. And when you see a lot of traditional cultures, they're land based.
It's interesting. I was in South Africa about 20 years ago, in Cape Town specifically, and there was an area called District 6. And in District 6, it was a lot of the African, like young political leaders. And so a lot of the political movements were coming from that area. And the white people, the Afrikaners, I think, they
Yeah.
decided that one of the problems is that those people were getting together, and there was a place called the Seven Steps. And they would, sit there and talk, and they would come up with what kind of resistance they were going to engage in.
Uh-huh.
And one day the power came in, literally just pulled people out of their houses, declared that the Black people could not own property anymore, split up families, just grabbed people randomly, put them on buses, and drove them off to really rural villages and just dropped them off and separated parents from children and husbands and wives and just dumped them. And so people were taking care of other people's kids, and you didn't know where you were. These were people who were in the city, right? And this all happened in the 60s.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so then they came and they literally just bulldozed the area down, like all of the buildings, everything. They just erased it. And so, these people were left to fend for themselves. And your kid, if you had a child, they could be a 4-hour walk away, or it could be a 3-day walk away. And they had no
Yeah.
resources. They had no idea even,
Right.
where to look. And so
Yeah.
families were destroyed. And when I was there in the late 90s, there was a university that was built there afterwards, because literally it was still barren, empty, open fields. And every night people would still go light fires in memory of that whole incident. And because people's lives were quite literally destroyed.
Yeah. Unbelievable. I bet you it worked though. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. It was decades before anything came back up politically, because, it was an entire community. It was devastated. And I'm sure
Yeah.
everybody else was terrified to do anything about it. And then the other thing that I thought of, you brought up earlier the Native American residential, like, boarding schools. And that was really a very concentrated effort to destroy
Yep.
the cultures. There were, at the peak of this program, there were more than 350 government funded and often church run boarding schools for Native
Yep.
Americans. And they
Yep.
stripped them of their language, their customs, their culture. And they only started phasing them out after years of indigenous activism against this
Mhm.
practice. But at that
Yep.
point, the government, they started this other program called the Indian Adoption Project. And they
Yep.
started pulling Native children into the child welfare system and then intentionally adopting them out to white families. So the practice went underground a little bit to get separation from the cultural roots. But man, they were tenacious in trying to make that happen.
Yeah. And as I said, the same thing happened to the Sami in Scandinavia.
Right.
And it's interesting to reflect on European diaspora, right? For whatever reason, people left their land. And like it's so much easier to become divorced from your language, your culture, the land in and of itself, your cultural practices. So yeah, it's effective.
Right. Yeah. This is all very depressing. Let's talk about how folklore can be used to resist all of these terrible things.
Absolutely. So it has, and it's pretty clear that folklore can be a huge tool in resistance. And often it arises organically. It's not, most people aren't going to say, okay, I'm going to use my folklore to fight this. It's just something that you fall back on.
Right.
And one of the main things is oral traditions. By using oral traditions, such as songs and stories and customs that are passed down orally, you have a way to preserve language and culture, even though you're excluded from the written record.
Right. And in that way, too, when you are having that oral tradition, as oral traditions do, they adapt to the circumstance that you're in. When you start to look at the tales, the Brer Rabbit tales, for example, and how those were always about, a trickster. Brer Rabbit was a trickster, and outsmarting, Brer Bear, who was, a more powerful figure, and always coming out on top. And that directly grew out of similar African stories that told of powerless creatures who achieved their desired outcomes through guile and not power. And so it's possible that those stories of Brer Rabbit are related to older kind of trickster stories, like Anansi, the spider trickster god. And, they adapted to the circumstance they were in. When you consider how many different cultures were brought together when those stories started to develop.
Absolutely. Yeah. I personally am very interested in syncretism because I do believe a lot of knowledge was saved that way. So, you might not know the names of gods or cultures or things anymore, but you preserve some identity through, like a great goddess or a goddess figure might be syncretized to the Virgin Mary, which I find that all very interesting and a rich ore.
Yeah.
Within those narratives, those oral traditions, often there's resistance encoded within them. So, embedded subversive subtext within folklore, turning seemingly innocuous tales into powerful ways to resist, right? So, the overculture doesn't understand what's being said in this story, but if you're part of the culture that tells the story, you understand that it's a subversive message. And these tend to persist even when explicit attempts are made to suppress them.
Sure. It does make me think about the subversive lyrics of folk songs. I think of a couple specifically. In the Underground Railroad, there was a song that they would sing that was called Follow the Drinking Gourd. And it was a song about, basically, it was saying, follow the gourd, which was the Big Dipper, right? And so,
Uh-huh.
of course, there's, part of the Big Dipper is the North Star. So it was sharing that they were supposed to go north, and that's how they could tell where north was, by following
Yeah.
the star. And so I think that's really interesting that, it was done in such a way that they're just singing a song, and the owners, they wouldn't be listening to whatever they were singing out in the fields while they were working, or in the house while they were working. And
Yep.
so it is definitely a way to get around it. And they also say that Harriet Tubman sang a song about, like, being bound for the promised land on the day that she was going to escape that night. And so she was
Uh-huh.
sort of telling the people that she lived with that she was getting out without letting
Yeah.
anyone else know, right?
Yeah. Amazing.
Yeah.
There's also rituals as cultural defiance. They're often suppressed during periods of upheaval, but they persist often underground or just in the home. And that way, cultural heritage remains intact. And that's related to what I just mentioned with the syncretism, where in your heart you might be praying to your own local goddess, but you have a statue of the Virgin Mary so that nobody knows what you're doing.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah, so let's take a look at how folklore plays a role in different parts of this. First one we want to look at is folklore's role in democratizing art and creativity. Folklore specifically rejects the notion that creative expression should be a privilege of the select few, and which we see often in the West, right? Like the artist is like a whole special category of person.
Right.
And then an artist who managed to support themselves, and now we get into the territory of capitalism, but an artist who managed to support themselves on their work, like that's like almost a demigod, right? For many.
Yes.
Folklore rejects that notion, and it says instead, art is a universal birthright and is accessible to everybody. And so you don't have to go to school for to learn like the right way to paint, like with the perspective that whatever what comes out of Renaissance Europe, maybe when we started that, they say art is everybody's birthright and accessible to everybody. And through that, folk art becomes a rebellion against artistic elitism. So only if you have an MFA can you write or paint or any of those things. As a matter of fact, everybody can.
Well, I think it's interesting too when I think about some of the groups that you see online now. I'm in a group that's about assemblage art, where people are taking, scraps of metal and assembling them into different, artistic endeavors. Or I'm in a group of people that do junk journals, and
Uh-huh.
are taking different, scraps of cloth and paper and images and putting them together as themed journals. And that people can find other people doing these things. And I've seen so many people who've joined a group saying, I've been doing this, but I didn't know what to call it. And so I
Right.
think we again see the internet is bringing folk art back to the people and saying, it's okay. You don't have to be selling your art if you don't want to. You can make it just because it's great fun.
Exactly. And through that, folklore becomes a voice against homogenized and mass-produced products. In folklore, we see things are made by you or your family or your community. That's what you surround yourself with. And that is not to say everybody should know how to do everything, but if your neighbor knows how to weave baskets and you make candles, like what a perfect trade that is.
Right.
And it should also, folklore is also a voice for the materials that you use to create this art should be easily accessible. They're often cheap or free, natural materials. And again, no official training is needed. So it's land based and culture based, and you see what you have available to you, and that is what you use.
Yeah. And I think that some of these practices, it becomes part of, the fabric of life. I was thinking about symbols that were painted on barns. So you start to see that and you start to say, oh, well, anybody can do this and everybody should be doing it because that's part of the folklore. It's a protective symbol. Or even the use of like paint blue, which they used, in the roofs of porches to keep the spirits out. And so you're starting to see people, use their creativity, and it just makes it easier for other people to say, I'm going to try something else. I'm going to try some art myself.
Exactly. The Haint Blue is actually really interesting. I think it's a Southern thing. You see it here a lot, the roofs of porches, but
Yeah.
also old dairy barns are painted blue because it's a color that repels flies.
Oh,
I just found that out. A neighbor here took us, like he has an old dairy barn on his land, and we were looking around, and it was painted that paint blue, and I was like, "Oh, look, that's so funny." And he was like, "Oh yeah, that keeps the flies away." Yep. Folklore also recognizes that creativity is an organic expression of diverse lived experiences. So you don't have to be like, this is not the right art that you're doing, and I am not doing the right art or the same art as this person because my lived experience is completely different.
Right.
And folklore also rejects the notion that the value of an individual is disposable. This art that this one particular person made is amazing because of its individuality.
Right, because you're going to bring all of your experiences, the materials that you connect with, the skills that you've developed, you bring that all into creating a piece of art. And so it tells the story of part of who you are. I've been doing a lot of purging lately, and I gave away a couple of antique photos that I had just bought over the years. And the man who took them said, if you have any other antique photos, let me know because I'll happy to take them off your hands. And so I started looking through my stuff, and I have a bunch of photos that I had put from my mother's things. When my mother passed away, I got a bunch of her photos, and I had put a bunch of them into an envelope because I didn't know who any of those people were. And so I thought, oh, maybe I'll give this to the guy. And I thought, no, you know what? Instead, I am going to take these and make some sort of assemblage with these pictures. And I'm going to call it something like Mary Stuart's Other Life and
Yeah.
create a story of, obviously they meant something to my mother because back in, the 30s and 40s, it was a lot more of a big deal to get these pictures.
Yeah.
And I don't want to just give them away to someone, but I don't know who the people are. So they're not meaningful to me. So that's what I'm
Right.
deciding to do with those.
Yeah, that's awesome. And that's again, like you're part of that family or that lineage and that culture. And so you putting that together is meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
Folklore also has a role in environmental consciousness. And I think a lot of that comes from being a land based. I mean, all people originally are based on their land, right? And so if you know that your parents lived in this land and your grandparents did, and your children will have to, you become much less likely to just be extractive of this land, right? And so, through that cultural wisdom, folklore often holds ecological insights
Mm-hmm.
for that particular land, serving as insights into the delicate balance between humanity and nature. Not to say that humans aren't also part of nature, but there's often wisdom and how to live lightly on the land that you're living on.
Some of the practices that are handed down when you talk about the terroir, the combination of the minerals in the soil and the
Yep.
weather and all of that. And so you need to learn about the land that you live on to be successful in growing food and
Yep.
in surviving generally. And I think that some of that folklore, you see so many Native American nature spirits, right? And it
Mhm.
really speaks to where the people lived and what they needed to do to be good stewards of the land.
Absolutely. And that's an interesting thing that you find in permaculture, even though there's some issues with that not having been acknowledged early on, but a lot of the information that came out of permaculture was based on indigenous technologies.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the next section we want to look at is folklore's resistance against capitalism. Folklore challenges consumerism. Folk narratives often carry messages that emphasize values beyond material accumulation and often warnings against that, right? If all you're looking to do is get more wealth, usually things don't end up well for you in folk stories.
Right. You never see the dragon that's like hoarding wealth as the hero of the story, right?
Exactly.
I think about a story like Rumpelstiltskin,
Uh-huh.
where it was about the father trying to say, oh, yeah, of course, my daughter can spin straw into gold. because he wanted, the king to marry his daughter. And it was all about the wealth. And Rumpelstiltskin came in to solve that problem for the girl. And the king would have never brought the girl into the castle if she hadn't been able to just generate wealth, because, kings need so much more wealth.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So a counter narrative that we find in folk stories, I think, is really important because we're so inundated with the get rich quick or be a billionaire, or that whole like wealth is on such a pedestal for us, where I think it's really important to have stories of community and care for each other and the land and how to raise children well and things like that. So yeah, in folklore, out of folklore also comes the idea of craftsmanship as a antidote to mass production. So traditional skills and crafts become a form of resistance, right? Instead of buying your baskets made out of exotic plants, what probably in China, and you buy them from a big box store, maybe learn to use the kudzu that's taken over your backyard to weave baskets.
Right. It makes me think about the Luddites, because that's really what that entire movement was about the craftsmen saying, no, we don't want all of these things to go to factories. And the lore that came out of that. So, of course, the Luddites were breaking the law. They were going around smashing equipment in factories. And the factory owners, of course, had the money and power to get the police to be patrolling and trying to chase them down. So often the Luddites would go out onto the moors, and they would meet out there away from, the prying eyes of the city. And because, it's the moor and the sightlines are pretty good, they would dress in disguise. And typically they would put on dresses and wear bonnets. And so they came up with this character. They created this bit of lore, and his name was General Ludd. And when they would draw pictures of him, of course, he'd be there in like a pretty yellow frock and leading the charge of the Luddites in general. So in that way, the resistance movement created the lore.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah. That's really cool. Another thing that folklore brings to us is the idea of community collaboration over individual gain. So what we see a lot in the West is this hyper individualization of people. And if you're lucky, it's a nuclear family that you're bonding together with. But more and more people are just like out there on their own, trying to make it work. And folklore really counters individualistic ethos that's encouraged by capitalism. And you see customs and stories that emphasize the collective well-being of a community over that of personal success.
Right, like the story of Stone Soup, where the guy, he's going to make the soup with a stone, and everybody comes out and says, well, I've got these carrots. And then they make this enough soup for everybody. And they're like, oh, it was just a stone. But they did all come together.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm reminded when I taught Waldorf kindergarten, we always made on Wednesdays, we always made soup at school for lunch. And it was the same. It was like every family was supposed to bring something, and it was never organized. It was like, you just bring something. And we always had bone broth at school, like canned bone broth at school. And like people showed up with the most random stuff, and the soup was always just amazing. My kids had that, and like the kids that I taught, some of them I still see, and they still talk about school soup and how amazing it was. And Tanya, can you make school soup? And I was like, no, I can't. Actually, I can't do that unless I have a group of children bringing, somebody who brings a package of hot dogs and somebody else a sweet potato, and yet still always amazing and tasty.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, really great. Another example of this that I just recently came across and absolutely love, and I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation, but it's a Slavic term that's kalaka. And the translation, I had to look the translation up online. It's either the spirit of community work or joint voluntary work. That's how it's defined. So it used to be when a man and a woman got married, the community would come together and for a couple of weeks over the summer would build them a house. And the houses were not as simple as you think they would be, but they were like 600 to 1200 square foot. And the whole community would just come together and put up this house. And it wouldn't cost you anything, right? What it would cost you is that for the rest of your life, for a couple of weeks in the summer, when somebody in your community got married, you would put in the sweat equity to help build their house. And you know how mad the banks and the mortgage companies and construction like it would collapse. And that's, I mean, I do believe that's why we have so many laws around building homes.
Right.
Where I live, a house has to be more than, I think it's 1,000 square foot. Like you cannot choose to build yourself a little house, which is nuts.
That is crazy.
Yeah, nuts. So yeah, very interesting. Community collaboration, I think we're going to find at the heart of fighting capitalism, because the very individualistic approach to life many of us have right now, I think is not going to carry us through.
And I think that we fool ourselves that we are individuals and not part of a community, because you're not driving somewhere to go get your food from the farmer. And, there's someone driving a truck that brings it. And so
Right.
it's a false narrative, I think, that we are individual.
When you say everybody's still part of a community, I think the problem that we're facing under capitalism is that our community bonds are often forged through exchange of money. So where everybody has to make a buck, right?
Right.
Because we're under capitalism. If you don't make that money, you don't build that house, and now you can't get married and have a family, for example. And the point that I'm trying to make is that capitalism isn't the same as trade. And I'm reminded of a quote by Daniel Quinn, who wrote a series of books that starts with the book Ishmael, that a lot of people are probably familiar with. But one of the things he says is that in nature and in indigenous communities, everybody is supposed to be able to make a living. Nobody is supposed to be able to make a killing. You ought not to have to make a living on the backs of other people.
That's a great quote.
And I do think that we find that in folklore, right? And in indigenous traditions, like you're part of this community. And so you can't really overcharge your neighbor for something, right? Because that's your neighbor. You live next to them.
Right.
But if everything is so far away, like you don't care about overcharging a person that you're never going to meet.
Well, and the other thing is, when you're in a community and you're trading and bartering, somebody has something you need, you have something somebody else needs, as opposed to
Exactly.
just going out and trading your time for money and then trading the money for everything that you need.
Right.
And that's where the disconnect comes from, I think, is that you feel like I can get anything I want from the store. And the store
Right.
isn't another person, right? It's
Right.
a corporation. So, I don't care. I want to get whatever I'm going to get. And there's no sense of reciprocation.
Absolutely. And that kind of gets us into the next point that I wanted to make, is that folklore gives us a look at alternative currency and heritage as an alternative currency. It positions heritage as a viable currency beyond monetary wealth. And the preservation and celebration of cultural heritage becomes a form of resistance against the commodification of traditions and the reduction of value of a tradition to a monetary metric. And we're all living under capitalism. And so everything is fuzzy. And most of us have to charge for our services, right?
Right.
But I think that's where you get sort of a disconnect between, you used to hear people say, I'm mostly online, like you shouldn't charge for a spiritual practice of one way or another. Like you shouldn't charge for divination or for teaching witchcraft or things like that. And people are like, well, that's crazy. I got to eat, right? How am I going to eat if I don't charge for my services? And yeah, I think we find ourselves in a period of time where that's a reality. We're all living under late stage capitalism. and most of us aren't liking it so much, but here it is.
Well, and I think that there's, a long tradition of getting paid for some of these practices, right? You've got the wise women, that if they were a midwife, they would be getting something back for their services, or if they were going to
Yeah.
do some kind of spell or give a charm, they were being compensated for that, not necessarily with money. But it's funny to me that people expect other people to just sort of take their time and energy for something and not get paid for it. And I get it. If you feel like someone has a gift, they should be sharing it. But it's like, yeah, okay, they can share that gift, but what are you sharing back?
Right.
And so, and I've heard it called energy exchange. And I think that that's usually,
Wow.
you hear that with like psychics and people who are
Yep.
doing energy spells. But it's like, no matter what, if you are doing a thing, unless you're just robbing people blind and not really doing anything, but if you're
Right.
giving a reading or creating a spell, you're using time and materials. And again, that's how we survive. And that's always how we've
Exactly.
survived. So I don't understand why it's a thing now.
I mean, for me, like mostly what I am looking at is that these days used to be back in the day, you would apprentice yourself to someone to learn a skill. And that meant at the beginning stages that you were basically that person's personal assistant and maybe you got to watch
Right.
first,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Nowadays, when you're talking about an apprenticeship, it's often paid and it's really just like a class, which is I had a very awesome experience actually apprenticing with a an herbalist early on many years ago, where I would work in her store for 1 day a week and like running the store and also making medicine and going out and collecting stuff. And then in exchange there was, and that in and of itself was like such a learning experience already, but then in exchange, 1 night a week, there was class. And she basically staffed her entire store like that. There was like 5 or so apprentices. And we all just ran the store 1 day a week, which was, I think, such an amazing example of keeping money out of the equation.
Right.
Because if she hadn't had us, she would have had to pay somebody to watch the store.
Right.
And instead, she shared her great, great wealth of knowledge.
And you would have had to pay for the class.
Right, exactly. So I do think folklore gives us those traditional ways of doing things. And that's not to say that I think money is the root of all evil and all that stuff. I do think capitalism, the way at least we're experiencing it currently, is extractive and not equalizing. What else do we have in here? Other ways to that folklore can help us beat capitalism. Alternative economies within folklore, we see alternative economic systems are often embedded, and kind of what we were just talking about, stories may reflect barter systems, communal sharing, and cooperative endeavors, which gives us alternative models to what we're seeing right now.
Right.
Folklore can also help us celebrate diversity. Folklore is a universal phenomenon that celebrates both our shared humanity and the unique and individual expressions found within regional cultures worldwide. That right there, right? Like
Right.
everybody's folklore, everybody's culture, everybody's lived experience is equally important and interesting.
Right.
You find inclusivity often in folk narratives and often also not. Remember how you were bringing up changelings and things like that, right? We also often see people being othered.
People need to be careful of that when they're talking about monsters or creatures and paying attention to where that might have really been about other people. And so when you're experiencing these stories, especially ones that have been captured, that it may not be a troll, right?
Right. Yeah, and I find it interesting to look at in Greek myths that there's an overlay of a newer culture that came in that then I guess couldn't get rid of the old folklore and then overlaid its own negative view of it within the stories, right? So you see that in Greek mythology, but you also see it in the Middle Ages in Europe, right, where pre-Christian deities were now the Christian devil kind of thing.
Right.
We see within the myriad of folk traditions all over the world, we show that there's so much diversity in the world, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
a Scottish culture is very different than, say, Maori culture, but they're equally important and interesting and impressive. And so we can, through folklore, we can celebrate those different traditions and customs.
Right. I love seeing the pictures like in the UK. I mean, there's so many. It seems like they have lots of like traditional costume and parades that they do so much
Uh-huh.
more than we do here.
Yeah.
And really, the only thing that we have that's similar, at least in the area I'm in, are organized powwows. And those are run by indigenous native people. But they have the traditional costume and they do the traditional dances and they explain them. I think people really are hungry to see what those traditions are and to understand them, whether it be a traditional way of embroidery or traditional costumes. It's so fascinating to see
Yeah.
all of the different ways that people express themselves through these folk arts.
Absolutely. And through folk art, it's another way of resisting homogenization. Globalized culture tends to flatten distinctions. Folklore, folk art tends to display them. And an interesting thing that I think folklore helps preserve endangered languages. And that is a very interesting thing just came up for me. I saw a preview for a movie that is made in the Netherlands. And I think it said in the early Middle Age, and all I've seen is a preview, but it said in the early Middle Ages, and it is the entire thing is spoken in a one of the Dutch dialects.
Hmm.
And it's a folk horror movie. I'm not a fan of horror, but I'm gonna watch it anyway, of course. Things like that I think are amazing. I also am remembering a movie called Atanarjuat, which is an Inuit movie that was all in the Inuit language, all Inuit actors. I think the whole cast and crew were Inuit. Phenomenal. I think it actually won an Oscar
Interesting.
like a long time ago. I think the English translation is The Fast Runner. If you haven't seen it, you really should. It's amazing.
I'm going to have to check it out. It makes me think of there is a short film that is done. It was made, I want to say the 80s or 90s, but it is all done in a language called Polari.
Ah,
And Polari is a language that was developed in the 60s in the UK. And it was illegal at that time to be homosexual and engage in any homosexual practices. And so Polari was a language that was developed in order to identify other, gay men primarily.
wow.
And so they would use that language in order to be able to say, I'm safe. Like you can openly be yourself around me because I am, someone who is not going to say anything about your lifestyle and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And there are still some words from Polari that we use in day-to-day language. And it sort of died out after a while because it was not needed anymore once the laws
Yeah.
changed. But it has made a resurgence lately because someone recently wrote a book about it. And so people are more
Wow.
aware of it now. But this one short film is done entirely in Polari. And some of the words are really, I mean, like drag, like we're talking about people being in
Uh-huh.
drag. That was initially a Polari word.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah. And when we talk about things being campy, that was a Polari word as well.
Wow.
Yeah. And there's a common word, not here, but in the UK, it's naff. And that was
Huh.
originally a Polari word as well. So it sort of like crept into our language, but it was initially a form of resistance.
Yeah, amazing. I love that. I had no idea about any of that. That's really great. The last point I wanted to make in this section, is using indigenous knowledge, or folklore preserves indigenous knowledge as a counter colonial wisdom. Folklore often encapsulates indigenous knowledge that is a repository of wisdom that can go against the colonial overculture that a lot of people live under.
Mm-hmm.
So traditional practices, beliefs, and ecological insights within folklore can challenge foreign ideologies. And one example that I've been coming across lately of that I'm really interested in is like within therapy, there's some people who are starting to become interested in learning about, teaching about indigenous ways to do therapy. And I don't know all that much about it, but one of the things that I'm aware of is that, like in traditional Western talk therapy, the focus is often on if you're not feeling good, so you should do some self-care or meditate, or like, and it's very individualistic, right? You need to take care of yourself. Where if you're looking at that from a more indigenous lens, the question would be more like, why aren't you feeling good? Like, oh, you're witnessing bad stuff happening to people around you. You can't protect yourself from that. You're a human. Like, it's good that you're feeling that. You shouldn't work on yourself. You should, your community should work on making the community a better place. And I'm probably really oversimplifying it, but the main point of it is viewing therapy more as a communal endeavor as opposed to an individualistic thing that you do to help yourself feel better or work better in a world. And like, another idea is that the Western world that many of us live in and the kind of life that many of us lead is anathema to how humans evolve to exist. So it's not crazy that you're not feeling great.
Yeah, and I think that we stigmatize when people aren't feeling great.
Mm-hmm.
And so we talk about, mental health issues and that kind of thing. And I think that there are other cultures that view that differently, that
Yeah.
see, when you talk about, instead of someone is schizophrenic or they're imagining things, they say like, oh, well, they're a prophet,
Right.
or that it takes on a spiritual kind of reverence. Or
Yep.
even people who, as we were talking about, the Polari language, people were stigmatized for being gay, and still to this day, my God, they are tried therapy to get them to like be straight
Right.
again. Like somehow
Yep.
that's a mental illness.
Right.
Where you have indigenous cultures, like in America, they were called two-spirit.
Right.
And there were lots of people who just would live as not the gender that they were assigned at birth. And it was completely normal. People didn't,
Right.
react to it. It was just fine. And so I think that looking at kind of bigger pictures, like, of course, we feel terrible a lot of times. And of course, that's going to affect your mental health when you do see, people being marginalized and oppressed and outright attacked. And what normal person wouldn't feel bad?
Yeah, exactly. So we've talked a lot about indigenous wisdom, and something that hasn't quite come up yet is what I like to call the problem with white people.
Right.
Like, as a white person, as a European living in diaspora, I guess, the idea that white people, and especially white people living in diaspora, have been given monolithic labels, like a white person. And that is not to negate at all the harms that have come from white people in the world, really, right? Have, at least in the last couple of centuries, probably more than that, been the main colonizers and imperialists, and white people have had a pretty negative effect on the world as a whole.
Right.
But I think the best way to start dismantling all that is also to start dismantling this monolith of white culture, because we're all not just white. We also have particular culture and heritage and lineage that, even if we're not in touch with, we could be in touch with again. So Europe it's not actually even a continent. It's part of a continent that is characterized by immense ethnic and cultural diversity, right? Each region has its own unique history, traditions, identity, traumas, triumphs. Reducing all this diversity to a single label of white neglects the rich tapestry of European cultures and divorces people from that, right? If I'm just white, I have less reciprocity and need for respect,
Mhm.
and I can be much more anonymous and walk through the world much more anonymous, which is something that takes you away from community, right? Like that's a thing in community, you're never anonymous.
Right.
So there's also a myriad of historical contexts and narratives in Europe and people of European descent,
Mhm.
which is a good thing for people to understand, like especially if you are white, understand all the histories, especially from the countries where your ancestors are, where you're from, or your ancestors are from. Oversimplifying this history may perpetuate stereotypes and masculine stories of different European communities.
Mhm.
And we see that interestingly in the US, where a lot of Europeans have moved to. You know, if you talk about just a bunch of white people, you're neglecting the stories of, say, the Irish who were colonized and starved and come to America for those reasons. And that's just one example of many, right?
Right.
I think if people start to see themselves more as part of a culture, and that could be like regional within the US or wherever you're living, right? You don't have to be like, oh, now I'm Scottish because my great grandma was Scottish. Like, that's not how it works. But I think if people seem to see themselves more as part of a culture and a community than just white, it can help with cultural enrichment and connection, preservation of heritage, and community building. So, overall, I think it would be a good idea for European Americans to start identifying more with not just white, right?
Right.
Identify with some sort of culture.
I think that part of the problem there too is, you see white supremacist groups kind of trying to co-opt
Yep.
a particular culture. And then you don't want to be associated with those types of groups. And so it's harder to claim some of that
Yep.
because you're like, oh, well, horrible people are claiming the Viking culture or whatever it is, Norse.
Yep.
People want to distance themselves from that. And so they don't want to claim some of that culture.
Yeah, that's an excellent point that you're bringing up. Definitely, I don't believe that you have to be white to practice heathenism, for example, or any of those things. I just believe that the homogenization and kind of flatlining of white culture in the US is detrimental.
Honestly, it's like race is all made up anyway, right? Like we make it
Right.
up based on the appearance of our skin. It's not real.
Right.
And so to identify with that instead of with cultural heritage, I think that's where the problem comes in.
Nice. 100%. Yeah.
It
Very
creates an
good.
otherness that just isn't real.
Right. That like excellent point. That's exactly how I feel about it too. It's wonderful how you put that. Yeah, thank you for that.
Sure.
Great. I think we've come to the end of this. My head is starting to kind of swim, but we have a little bit more for you, and that is how can you do folkloring around this subject yourself at home? And one of the things that I think is really important is storytelling. Research folk tales and share them with people. Learn how to tell a story. I know it's sort of terrifying at first to sit in, even if it's just your kids, it's sort of terrifying to tell a story by heart, but it's not as terrible as it sounds once you get going. And it's a beautiful, wonderful skill that you will always have at your disposal at any time. You can, once you've learned a story, you can whip it out.
Right. We love telling stories. I mean, that's general conversation where, hey, here's what happened to me at work today.
Yeah.
Or, I was driving and you can't believe what I saw. And so we tell stories constantly, but I think that we do tend to forget that some of these personal narrative kinds of stories that are part of our past, our ancestors' past, are going to be lost if people don't tell them,
Yep.
they'll be lost with the person. So I think one of the things you can do is to ask your elders about stories so they aren't lost. And I think that it's, a folklore practice that was what people did, people who study folklore, they were going out and capturing these stories. And I know that
Yep.
the nonprofit, the Folklore Library and Archive, they capture these stories and they ask people, go out and talk to your elders, get these stories, let's preserve them.
Yeah.
And so I think it's an important thing to do, even if you only do it internally within your family, to hear some of those stories. Like, I wish I had asked my mom about those pictures and the people in those pictures and how she knew them. And I don't
Right.
know that now, and it's lost.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's a really great resource, the Folklore Library and Archive. So yeah, please go and check them out. Another thing to do is participate in traditional practices, whether it's celebrating seasonal rituals, learning a folk dance. You know how fun folk dances are? Preserving linguistic diversity, learn a language that
Yeah.
was somewhere down in your lineage or that you're just super attracted to, especially like learn some weird ones. Like, I don't know, like the Georgian language, the Republic of Georgia. That's a cool one. If I had easy access to lessons on that, I'm not at all, that's not at all in my lineage, but yeah, I'm fascinated by that culture and that country and that language. It's amazing. Yeah, learn to basket weave or make your own candles or any of those things. Another thing to do is create community and be collaborative with your community. For example, community gardens or roving work parties, which is something that we do here with our friends, where a couple of families come together and one Sunday a month over the summer months, all the families go to one family's home and work on some big projects. There's lots of ways to collaborate with people and go seek them out and do them.
You can even go to like Meetup and find people that are doing interesting things in your community.
Uh-huh.
And I've taken some primitive skills classes that I just found online through Meetup, and it was a lot of
Oh,
fun.
that's
And
cool. Yeah.
everybody was interested. I've done, carving wooden spoons, a couple of different things.
Fun. Artistic expression, engage in folk art. Don't let anybody tell you that you can't X, Y, and Z. Or support local folk artists who resist the homogenization of culture.
Or participate in public art movements like yarn bombing.
Yep.
If that's what, if knitting is your jam, then it's fun to sort of see that in the wild where people are participating in a way. It's almost like reading a book, right? You're not participating in the same moment in the same space, but there is that
Yep.
connection.
Yeah. It's so fun to see that. Another thing, we already sort of touched on it, but learn traditional crafts. And there's, just like you said, through meetups, there's folk schools all over the country, which are all of them just absolutely amazing. I think, as far as I know, pretty much all of them, you can ask for scholarships and they're usually pretty generous.
Mhm.
You can take online classes. Like right now, I'm taking an online basket weaving class and it is phenomenal. And I'm learning so much and I can make it happen when I have some downtime or, late at night or something like that. It's amazing. And man, you can learn just about anything on YouTube too. Just
Oh,
search
absolutely.
for what you're interested in and you can probably find somebody teaching you exactly how to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I took a class not too long ago about Regency cooking.
Oh
Yeah, cooking these
yeah.
foods from that period of time. And it was fascinating.
So fun. Environmental consciousness. start wildcrafting, which means picking things in the wild for medicine or crafts. Foraging is like another word for it. I think they're pretty much overlapping. And that is where YouTube and the library and classes can come in really, really handy. You really need to learn some rules about over harvesting and only picking the things that you know exactly what you're picking, which that in and of itself is land-based practice, right? Learning about the environment that you find yourself in.
And also, you have to be careful with that because there are certainly places where it is illegal to forage.
Sure.
Like in the US, you can't forage in forest preserves.
Mm-hmm.
And because they want to keep that, natural environment. And if people are foraging, then they're disrupting the balance of nature that is the whole point of the forest preserve.
Yeah, I personally, and I recommend that people focus on invasives in their area and what they can be used for. Because, I mean, there's definitely a train of thought that says that the invasives are here for a reason. We just got to figure out what that reason is. And for me personally, so here, kudzu is it's ridiculously invasive. It's everywhere. But I am learning how to use it for basketry, and it is phenomenal for that. Just amazing. Because, I was thinking, oh, maybe I'll have to plant a willow patch to use for making willow baskets. But I think instead, I'm just going to use kudzu.
That's great.
Yeah. Also, a thing that you can do is resist capitalism through thoughtful consumption. So, if you're going to buy or trade, try to make it local and handmade, but maybe you just don't need as much as you think you do either.
Right.
Acknowledge and celebrate diversity in all its beautiful ways.
I think that one way that you can do that, you talked earlier about having like work parties, but you could consider having like a potluck meal with friends or neighbors, or a progressive dinner where in each home, or each home brings a traditional meal from their culture and then can talk about it. So you can learn about different traditional meals, or if you need to research them yourself from, whatever your ancestry is. And that's a good way to share the diversity with people you know.
Yeah. Use folklore in daily language, by which I mostly mean use proverbs or ways. Like, I really loved when I was in Ireland, I really loved how people for real said top of the morning to you. That was not just from movies. Absolutely love that. And do more of those things. And as we said earlier, learn an ancestral language.
Right. It can be important too to really seek out kind of diverse writers and storytellers so you can start to hear different perspectives and not just kind of default to the tales that are, we talked about earlier, Grimm brothers or Anderson or Andrew Lang, the ones that we're most familiar with. There's a lot of other stories out there that you can experience if you just start looking for it.
Absolutely. Well, I think we came to the end of what we had for you today. It was a pretty long and meaty discussion, I think. We want to encourage you to reach out to us if you had any questions or comments. Thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. And we'll talk to you soon.
As always, thanks for listening to Folkloring. If you liked what you heard, please consider giving us a rating and review, and don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. If you have any questions or comments, or would like to suggest a topic for a future episode, please email us at folkloringpod@gmail.com or message us on Facebook or Instagram. You can find Tanya at Folklore Home Companion on Instagram, where she writes about European folklore and traditional life. You can find Tracy at the Folklore Podcast as the theater, film, and storytellers correspondent and producing the Stories from the Hearth podcast. Hope to talk to you again soon.